This paper examines how societal inequalities intersect with the Latino cultural value of Marianismo and how it shapes the educational experiences of Latina college students. Drawing from scholarly literature with a primary focus on qualitative studies, these findings are interpreted through the lens of the sociological imagination. This paper reveals that while Marianismo may reinforce gendered expectations such as caregiving, self-sacrifice, and familial prioritization, it can also function as a protective force, providing identity, resilience, and motivation. Latina educational mobility cannot be understood as individual choice alone, but rather must be viewed within the USA's structural conditions and Latino American culture. These findings show the importance of considering both cultural values and systemic inequities when examining and addressing educational disparities among Latina students. Research topic: How Marianismo and systemic inequalities shape the educational experiences of Latina college students. Research significance. My research is significant because it synthesizes studies on Marianismo and other structural inequalities to show how Latina women experience higher education. As Latinas remain underrepresented in colleges, so do the studies that explore how institutional racism influences the way they adopt or reinterpret Marianismo beliefs. Using the sociological imagination, this paper illustrates how cultural values can both limit and support educational mobility as social forces shape personal choices. I began crafting my thesis based on the question, to what extent do gender roles like Marianismo influence the college experience for Latinas in the United States in relation to their self-concept, mental health, and sexual exploration? And then I began to argue that, through Mill's sociological lens, Latina educational mobility cannot be understood as merely a personal choice or trouble, but rather their actions are shaped by the interaction of USA's structural inequalities and Latin America's cultural expectations, which are rooted in Marianismo. As Latinas navigate college, they continually reinterpret Marianismo through adaptation and negotiation, even as these cultural norms are influenced by larger societal forces. Some sociological questions explored are: how does Marianismo influence Latina college students' educational decisions? In what ways do institutional inequalities impact Latina women's access to higher education? Can Marianismo function as both a barrier and protective force in Latina students' pursuit of education? And to what extent do gender roles like Marianismo influence the college experience for Latinas in relation to self-concept, mental health, and sexual exploration? Before we discuss Marianismo, we must understand the systems that frame educational access for Latinas today. And the reality is that despite legal progress, the foundation of opportunity remains uneven. Douglas Massey in Categorically Unequal helps us understand that despite the outlaw of segregation in 1954, its effects on the foundation of the United States are still seen through mechanisms like racial steering. Racial steering acts as a barrier between minority groups and high quality and safe K-12 education, which help steer them towards pursuing higher education. And through current economic disparity, we can see the lingering effects of racist laws. The Department of Labor shows a significant gap between the median annual income of non-Hispanic white women and Hispanic white women. We do have to note that in the United States Census, Latinos and Hispanic people are grouped together as one, despite some Latinos and like Brazilian people are not Spanish, but they are Latinos. This gap reveals institutional racism left behind by laws that penalized hiring undocumented workers, which then led to employers discriminating against anyone who looked Hispanic by either, not hiring them or paying them under the table, so the government did not know that they were employing them. Thus, they were able to pay the workers less than minimum wage. In conclusion, we can see how discrimination in the labor market perpetuates low economic status among Latinos, which can lead to just racist actions and attitudes among the populace, which steers Latinos into underfunded neighborhoods, which lack opportunity and create a cycle of low integrational mobility, meaning that schools that Latinas attend before college often lack the resources to prepare them for the hurdles of higher education. Progress versus disparity. While representation has grown, significant gaps remain. Only 17.9% of Latinas have earned a bachelor's degree and 10% a doctoral degree, as Latinos remain underrepresented, with only 32% of those aged 18 to 24 enrolled in college. Barriers to entry. Financial obligations are a primary citation for not pursuing degrees. These statistics indicate broader social structures that guard educational pathways against the Latino community. And then some cultural context. Marianismo is defined as patriarchal norms stemming from the Virgin Mary, which idealize and push women to strive to be pure, humble, and devoted to the family. And this creates a tension with modern American university values, which prize autonomy, ambition, and individuality. Within these structural constraints, the family becomes the primary world for young Latina women. Castillo and colleagues developed the Marianismo belief scale to measure sort of these cultural constraints. It includes 5 pillars, such as the virtuous and chaste pillar, and subordinate to others. There are other pillars, but for this presentation, I will focus on just these 2. And these pillars, the whole Marianismo belief system, is very tied to familismo, which is the value of putting the collective family above the self. As the first agent of socialization, the family implants values that persist through life. If we look at this through mid stages of development, we see that young Latinas observe and then imitate their mothers. Marianismo, familiar values, expects women to be the strength of their family and prioritize their family above all. They learn that their worth comes from self-sacrifice and subordination. They grow up caring for their siblings, managing the households, which behaviors that are deeply internalized by the time they reach college age. Familismo is a determinant factor in college enrollment. Some Latinas decide to stay home to provide immediate financial support, while others view degrees as a long-term family aid. This creates sort of an internalized double bind. They want to help their family, but they're not too sure which way is the best way to go. They can either provide immediate financial means, sacrificing higher education, which also means that they can stay close by with their family and continue helping out with these household chores, or they can pursue a degree to provide more long-term familiar help and raise the family's social status. But there is also this other conflict where the family does not want their daughter to be apart from them. So Marianismo can encourage education, but it also places just an immense burden on women. And in a qualitative study by Brown, it was found that Latino parents define a good life as one of hard work. Consequently, Latinas feel a heavy moral obligation to use their education to raise the social status of their family, which places extra burden on the students, which can be seen as positive or negative, depending on how you view it. There's been this other research that shows that Latinas in college don't necessarily reject cultural values, so while some use Marianismo as a way to stay home and be like, oh, help the family, the ones that do go off, aren't necessarily straying away from Marianismo beliefs. They're sort of just negotiating them and working them into their life. And it's sort of just education postpones the effects of these patriarchal expectations. Doesn't necessarily mean that they are distancing themselves from these values. Through the lens of conflict theory, Marianismo acts as a device reinforcing patriarchal control and gender roles, defining a woman's moral worth through chastity, and compliance. When Latinas enter the university, they encounter hookup culture, an environment that creates massive culture shock against their upbringing of purity and chastity. In a study done by Vizquez, it was found that Latinas who subscribed to the spiritual pillar of Marianismo were actually less likely to report abstinence, which is sort of contrary to what many would believe as the Christian Catholic religion, which is the most common religion practiced among Latinos, practices abstinence until marriage. But this suggests that they may have assimilated into American values, or perhaps are transforming their spiritual values to focus on monogamy rather than total purity. And there are some health risks. The demand for purity creates a conflict with campus hookup culture, and the lack of open discussion about sex can lead to several health consequences. For example, high endorsement of the virtuous and chaste pillar found a decrease in STI and HIV testing, possibly due to the cultural shame of being associated with sexual activity. There are some dangers of power dynamics. If a young woman is raised to listen to the man of the house and prioritize others' needs and pleasures, she's at risk in a hookup culture that requires assertiveness. Therefore, subscription to the subordinate to others pillar is dangerous when paired with American college hookup culture, where Latinas are at higher risk for sexual predation. It was found that there's no significant link between Marianismo beliefs and condom use, further suggesting a gap in sex education, likely a result of those underfunded schools I mentioned earlier, and perhaps an example of a culture uncomfortable with discussing safe sexual practices with their daughters. Ultimately, these patriarchal norms frame compliance as a virtue. It is important to note, however, that most current research excludes LGBTQ+ Latinas, which is a significant gap in our understanding of how these norms apply to non-heteronormative students. All this, the academic pressure, the sexual culture shock, the structural barriers, takes a toll on the mental health. Latinas experience multiple identity stress. They feel torn between their home identity and their college identity, often leading to a sense of isolation in both places. Despite this, Latino students access mental health treatment at half the rate of their white peers. This is due to stigma, costs, and fear that a therapist simply won't understand their culture. In conclusion, we must recognize that a Latina's path to upward mobility is complex. Latino's position in the social hierarchy is shaped not simply by individual choices, but by systemic inequalities such as educational disparities, immigration policies, and unequal labor markets. For Latina women, these structural barriers intersect with cultural expectations rooted in Marianismo and Familismo. So, gender plays a big role, which can limit personal development. Furthermore, as we found, Latinas internalize Eurocentric beauty standards. These cultural values also provide identity. They monitor their bodies to fit in, especially when families reinterpret society that marginalizes them. Through this sociological imagination, another double bind, personal decisions stressed by the pursuing higher education support to help can be understood as the stress is shaped by broader social forces and accessible. Therefore, Latina mobility relies not only on ambition but on the social and cultural conditions that shape it. If we want to improve outcomes for these women, we must support them not just as students, but as individuals navigating the intersection of two very different worlds.